So we've just navigated the intricate landscapes of psychology and emotion. Now let's pivot to the very engine room of knowing itself, the theory of knowledge. Think of intelligence not just as smarts but fundamentally as the power to know. And how do we know things? Through ideas, which are like little mental postcards representing actual objects out there or in here. This immediately sets up a neat classification system. For every kind of thing we can know, there's a corresponding mental tool, a faculty designed to handle it. So what kinds of things are we dealing with? The text lays out three main categories, which is actually a bit more than the original text says, but contextually makes sense. First, the stuff we encounter directly through our senses, the external world. Second, things we know exist even if we're not currently experiencing them, like historical facts or mathematical truths, the realm outside immediate experience. And third, the landscape of our own minds, our thoughts, feelings, consciousness itself. For each of these, we have specific tools. For the external world, it's perception, mediated by our senses, reason, and consciousness. For things only virtually present like memories or imagined scenarios, we use conception, association, memory, imagination. And then there are the heavy hitters, the complex operations like abstraction, attention, judgment, and reasoning, which are really sophisticated combinations of these basic tools. It's like having different tools in your mental toolbox for different jobs. Let's zoom in on external perception, the gateway to the outside world. What does it take for this process to kick off? Three key ingredients. First, something needs to be around us. Seems obvious, right? But hold on, sometimes we perceive things that aren't there at all, hallucinations. So proximity isn't absolute. Second, the classic physiological chain. The object hits a sensory organ, sends a signal down nerves, and finally reaches the brain. Pretty straightforward biology. Third, and this is crucial, our own self has to step in. Raw sensory data is just a jumble. It's our mind that organizes it into coherent perceptions. Think of it like having a million pixels hitting your eye. Without your brain putting them together into a picture, you'd just see a blur. For now, though, let's park the questions about whether the object really exists and whether our self is doing the organizing, and focus purely on the middleman, the senses themselves, how they connect the physical world to our nervous system. Okay, when we talk senses, most of us immediately think of the big five: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, classic stuff. But the text pushes us to think broader. It suggests sense isn't just about those specific organs, but any source of information about the outside world. And guess what? Some of these sources aren't tied to a single spot on your body. Enter two newer players, the muscular sense and the vital sense. The muscular sense is your body's internal GPS and fitness tracker rolled into one. It tells you where your limbs are, how tense they are if they're getting tired. Ever tried to draw accurately with your eyes closed? That's your muscular sense working overtime. Then there's the vital sense, also called sensus vagus, the wandering sense. This is your body's general weather report. Are you feeling good, bad, tired, sick? It's like an internal touch that doesn't pinpoint location, but gives you a holistic sense of your physical state. As Lemon pointed out, knowing you're ill by feeling it isn't done by sight or hearing. It's this deeper, more diffuse sense at work. Now, are all these senses created equal? Nope. The text ranks them like players on a team. At the bottom, we have smell and taste. They're pretty basic, mostly triggering reactions or emotions. You need a lot of learning to actually use them for detailed knowledge. Next up is the vital sense. Interestingly, Lemon himself thought this was the star player, claiming we know the world through it. But the text argues against that, saying it's mostly about feeling states, not precise information. Moving up the ladder, we hit sight and hearing, the aesthetic twins, giving us beauty and sound. Then comes touch, the MVP in many ways. It's incredibly precise, can even compensate for sight or hearing loss. Remember Anaxagoras? He famously said we think because of the hand, highlighting touch's role. And finally, at the top of the pyramid, the muscular sense. It's the ultimate precision instrument, working with touch to give us a solid grasp of space extension. And crucially, it's what makes us active agents in the world, distinct from passive objects. So from fuzzy feelings to precise spatial awareness and agency, that's the hierarchy. Okay, so we have these senses. But what exactly do we perceive naturally versus what do we learn to perceive? Think about taste. You naturally get flavor. Smell gives you odor, hearing gives you sound. Muscular sense gives you resistance. Touch gives you extension. Vital sense gives you general body state. Pretty straightforward, right? But then comes sight, and things get murky. What does sight give us naturally? Is it just color? Or does it also give us extension, the sense of space, distance, surface? Because honestly, how can we separate seeing red from seeing it on a wall? Is this sense of space something we're born with, part of sight's intrinsic nature? Or is it something we build up through experience and education? This sparks a philosophical debate. This leads to a classic showdown, nativism versus empiricism regarding sight and extension. Nativists say, hey, the eye just knows space. Empiricists retort, nope, that's learned. Let's break down extension into its parts. First, distance. Here the evidence seems pretty clear, leaning towards empiricism. Look at William Cheselden's famous case, a man born blind, operated on later in life. When he first saw, he described colors appearing on a flat plane, like a painting on the inside of his eyelid. No depth perception initially. That strongly suggests distance isn't innate to sight. What about surface? Cheselden's experiment is tricky here. Maybe the blind man already had a vague idea of surfaces from other senses, influencing how he interpreted the visual input. So no smoking gun there, bottom line? No experiment definitively proves sight gives us extension naturally. Given that, the argument leans heavily towards empiricism. We probably build our understanding of space, including extension, through experience. So if extension isn't innate, how do we even start linking color and space? Alexander Bain proposed theories like local signs, suggesting things like time perception and the muscular sense help us construct this link. Basically, our brain uses various clues to stitch together the experience of color and the experience of space. And remember that empirical argument? Even if sight could magically project color into space on its own, it would be a very basic, primitive sense of space. Think about how long it takes kids to develop a proper understanding of 3D space. Since sight struggles with depth, it's hard to argue it innately grasps the other dimensions of space either. The conclusion remains: experience is key to building our rich concept of spatial extension. All right, we've talked about how we perceive the external world. But does that world really exist outside us? That's a big question, splitting into two. 1. Does anything exist outside my mind? 2. If so, is it really like I perceive it? Before tackling those, we need to ask, where does the idea of externality itself come from? Where does the concept of the non-self originate? Ideas, remember, either pop into our heads given or are built by us constructed. Could the idea of externality be constructed? Stuart Mill offered a theory. He said all we know comes via sensation, which is inherently subjective. When I see red, I conclude a red object exists. But how? Mill's answer: we distinguish between actual sensations happening now and possible sensations we know we could have, even if we don't right now. Think entering a room, door, table, book. These happen regularly. The possibility of these sensations implies they have a cause separate from my current mental state. That cause, he argued, is the external world. And when we group these possible sensations together, like color plus shape, we perceive an object. But wait, Mill's theory hits some serious roadblocks. First, sensations are purely subjective experiences. How can you build an objective idea of the external world solely from subjective stuff? It's like trying to build a concrete house using only sandcastles. Second, the distinction between possible and actual sensations isn't enough. Just because certain sensations happen in sequence regularly doesn't automatically mean an external object is causing them. Couldn't it just be a law of my own mind, or some deterministic process within me? The general takeaway: if externality is built from sensations and sensations are subjective, you can't build an objective idea. Since we clearly do have an objective idea of the external world, the conclusion must be, the idea of externality is given, not constructed. Okay, if it's given, how is it given? Is it handed to us fully formed by our experiences? Or is it something deeper, inherent in the very structure of our minds, an a priori idea? Let's test the experience hypothesis. Some philosophers like Hamilton said all sensations imply externality. We shot that down earlier. Subjective sensations can't yield objective ideas. Others, like Maine de Biran, focused on the muscular sense of effort or resistance, the feeling of hitting a wall. He argued only this resistance proves an external obstacle. But even that fails. That resistance could be psychological, a mental block, or just an illusion. So, if it's not constructed and not given by experience, what's left? It must be given a priori, baked into the nature of our consciousness itself. It's not learned, it's fundamental. So this a priori idea of externality, how does it actually work? It's tied to another fundamental concept, space. We have this innate idea of space surrounding us, making it distinct from ourselves. Before we have any specific sensations, space is just a potential backdrop. But the moment a sensation occurs, our mind automatically does two things. 1. It treats the sensation as an object, something external. 2. It places this external object somewhere within that pre-existing spatial framework. So externality arises from this spontaneous objectification within space. Now, here's a twist. While Mill was wrong about the origin of externality, he was right about one thing. We do impose order on our sensations. We group together the sensations that always occur together, like color and shape, and then place the cause of that group in space. So Mill gets half credit. Okay, we've established the idea of externality is given. But does it match reality? Does the external world actually exist out there? To figure this out, let's use logic and induction. Imagine you have a sensation, say D. Where did it come from? Logic helps. If A always leads to B, A likely causes B. If A happens often without B, A probably doesn't cause B. Method 1. Obstacle argument. You're in a room experiencing sensations A, B, C. Suddenly, sound D occurs. D wasn't part of A, B, C. Could something have blocked A, B, C from producing D? If the blockage was internal, part of your mind, then A, B, C should still be happening after D. But they are, so the blockage must be external. Therefore, D's cause is external. Method 2. Absence argument. You enter a room, experience A, B, C, D. You leave, come back later, your mental state is now A1, B1, C1. You enter again, experience D. Could A, B, or C from the first visit cause D now? No, they weren't present. So D's cause must be external. Both arguments point to the same conclusion. Something exists outside us. Great, so the external world exists. But what is it really like? Is it just as we perceive it? Or is there a hidden reality beneath our perceptions? Let's categorize the qualities we perceive. There are two types. First, secondary qualities: heat, color, taste, smell, sound. These aren't essential properties of things. We can imagine objects without them. Science tells us these are often just forms of motion affecting our senses. Think of heat as rapid molecular motion, color as light wavelengths hitting our eyes. These are appearances. Then there are primary qualities: extension and movement. These are supposedly the real deal. You can't conceive of an object that isn't extended in space or capable of moving. Everything that exists must have these. All secondary qualities are just appearances related to these primary ones. So for now, we can provisionally define matter as simply extended substance that can move. But hold on, are these primary qualities, especially extension, really objective? Maybe they're just sophisticated illusions too. The argument starts with a principle. If something is made of parts, you should be able to measure it, at least in theory. Now, extension seems measurable, right? But let's dig deeper. Can we divide extension into a finite number of parts? No. Because extension is continuous, you can always cut it smaller, and each piece will still be extended. So no finite division works. What about dividing it into an infinite number of parts? Here's a snag. The very idea of an infinite number is contradictory. A number is defined by being able to increase or decrease it indefinitely. Infinity, by definition, is fixed. You can't add one to it or subtract one from it. Mathematicians use infinity, sure, but it's usually a symbolic shorthand for limits, not an actual number. So, extension can't be divided into an infinite number of parts either. So we're stuck. On one hand, extension is a whole made of parts, so it should be measurable. On the other hand, we've just shown it can't be divided into a finite number of parts, nor an infinite number of parts. It's impossible to measure it. That's a contradiction. What does this mean? The argument concludes that the very idea of extension is flawed, a deceptive appearance. If objects aren't truly extended, what are they? They must be made of a finite number of unextended parts. Think about it. Physics and chemistry already talk about atoms, indivisible units. Maybe these are the real building blocks, not extended bits of space. Okay, if objects are made of unextended parts, what are these parts? We can only understand them by analogy with the only thing we truly know, ourselves. What are we? We are conscious, self-moving forces. So, these unextended elements might be like unconscious forces, lacking consciousness and intelligence but possessing activity. Think of them as the fundamental forces that interact and limit each other. Our self perceives these forces because they act upon it. So, the real nature of objects isn't extension and movement, but a finite number of elementary forces. And what about extension and movement? They're just appearances, generated when our senses deform these underlying forces. The only truly real thing is force itself, acting directly without needing the medium of space. Our will can act on our intellect directly, and the external world acts on us through these forces. Where does this leave us philosophically? We believe the external world exists objectively, so we're realists. But realism comes in flavors. One version, mechanism or dynamism, championed by Descartes, sees the world as just extended stuff in motion. Another, spiritualism, associated with Leibniz, sees the world as composed of beings similar to us but mostly unconscious. The text explicitly adopts this spiritualist view. It posits a continuity of nature. From the highest consciousness down to the simplest particles, everything is spirit or force, varying only in degree of awareness. There's no truly dead or inert matter. Everything is animated, participating in this cosmic dance of forces. Even extension and movement are just appearances generated by our perception of these underlying forces. Now let's turn inward to consciousness. This is the faculty that lets us know our internal world, our thoughts, feelings, etc. Just like external perception, it needs two conditions. 1. A modification of the self, the object of consciousness, and 2. The self itself as the knowing subject. Leibniz's insight was that our internal world has perceptions, which we might not be fully aware of, and apperceptions, which we are aware of. This opened the door to doctrines like the philosophy of the unconscious, notably by Hartmann. He pointed to phenomena that seem barely perceived, or not perceived at all. Think hearing the ocean as one sound, not individual droplets. Or habits making actions automatic, like the miller who stops hearing his own mill. Passion can numb pain during battle. Obsessions can blind us to obvious things. Even problem solving can happen unconsciously. Hartmann argued these prove vast unconscious processes underpin consciousness, memory, instinct, even our sense of will. He concluded we're mostly just puppets of the unconscious, and common sense about free will is an illusion. But does Hartmann's unconscious puppet show hold water? The text argues it doesn't. Those examples, hearing the sea, habit, passion, don't necessarily prove complete unconsciousness. Couldn't there be a faint, barely registered awareness? And if these phenomena are truly unconscious, how do they ever become conscious again? The text counters with facts. Sometimes we can recall when an unconscious solution popped into our head. We often feel a mental strain or fatigue during unconscious processing, suggesting some level of awareness. Plus, there's that old Latin saying, to perceive is nothing else than to realize that one perceives. How can a psychic event leave consciousness entirely? And if it leaves, how does it return? It's arbitrary to assume parts of the soul are shielded from consciousness. The conclusion? There's nothing absolutely unconscious in our psychological life. Every state of consciousness is in some degree conscious. Okay, consciousness reveals our internal states. But does it also reveal something else, the self? Every thought, feeling, sensation is attributed to an I. Where does this idea of the self come from? Is it constructed? Taine tried to build it. Take all our states of consciousness, split them into external perceptions and internal emotions. Perceptions imply something outside, emotions imply something inside. Voila! The imaginary container for the inside states is the self. But the text refutes this. Is the self really just a container? Isn't it more like a center, a point where all our mental states converge? And Taine's method assumes these internal states exist outside the self, which is impossible. For any state of consciousness to exist, there must be a subject experiencing it, and that subject is the self. You can't build the foundation before the building exists. So, like externality, the idea of the self can't be constructed, it must be given. If the idea of the self is given, how? Unlike externality, the self isn't out there separate from us, it's us. There's no gap between us and the self. So the idea of the self isn't distorted by passing through a medium like the senses. Instead, it's given directly in consciousness itself. When you have a thought, you are aware of the thought, and aware of yourself as the thinker simultaneously. The very fact that we can conceive of a self, that we use the pronoun I, proves the self exists. Experience itself confirms its reality. It's not something inferred, it's something directly known. So the self exists. But what is it? Some philosophers, like Maine de Biran, talked about a deeper unconscious substance underlying the self. Cousin also suggested something beyond consciousness. But the text dismisses this. The idea of an unconscious substance is vague. What is it? If it's active, we should see its effects. If it's inactive, what's its purpose? It's meaningless. The soul and the self are one and the same. What defines the self? Three key characteristics. Unity, it's one, indivisible. Identity, it remains the same self despite constant change. Causality, we feel responsible for our actions. We are the cause of our will. These ideas, unity, identity, causality, can't come from the external world, which is multiple, changing, and shows only succession, not causation. They must come from the self itself. A being with unity, identity, and causality is what we call a person. Now, being a person isn't a binary switch. We're all persons, but we differ in how much we are the cause of our own actions. Our willpower varies. Some act on impulse, others on deliberate choice. Finally, is consciousness a distinct mental faculty? Some say no, because its objects, thoughts, feelings overlap with other faculties. But the text argues yes. Consciousness doesn't just reveal phenomena, it reveals the self and its core attributes, unity, identity, causality. These unique insights make consciousness a distinct faculty. Together with external perception, consciousness provides experience. And that brings us to the end of this exploration of how we know, setting the stage for the next big question. Can experience alone explain all our knowledge?